In this podcast, Podcast 2, I'm joined by distinguished circular economy author, expert and early pioneer of the circular economy, Walter Stahel, author of The Circular Economy, A User's Guide, published in collaboration with the Ellen MacArthur Foundation and from where the context of my research was inspired. Perhaps the most accurate introduction to Walter is found in the foreword of the Circular Economy User's Guide, written by Dame Ellen MacArthur. No one has done more to make the case for the transition to a circular economy than my friend Walter Stahel, not only because he has been doing it longer and with more care and humility than anyone else, but first and foremost because his words have proved to be just what our changing times need. His strength, his persistence, and a lifetime of reflection built on observing the worlds of business, design and manufacturing have culminated in this short book. Every page contains either something worth learning or an expression that will be picked up and shared. Books of this ilk are rare. My other guest is Bettina Heller, Programme Officer from the Consumption and Production Unit at the United Nations Environment Programme, where she is coordinating their work on sustainability and circularity in the textile value chain. In 2020, UNEP produced the Sustainability and Circularity in the Textile Value Chain Report, mapping out the circular supply chain, emphasising the need for post-consumer clothing circularity through holistic business and industrial solutions. My thesis argues that contrary to Walter's mantra, the centre of the circular economy is you, the UNEP report still sidelines consumers as part of the value chain. Therefore, my research puts consumers, you, meaning all of us, as the users of products, at the centre of the circular economy. So, 92 million tonnes of clothing is landfilled globally annually. This is the key problem that I decided to tackle in my research. And a key issue was because we don't understand enough about why this happens from the micro level to the macro level, and how this 92 million tonnes ends up in landfill, generally in the global south, as well as in our local authority landfill sites. And this is not only an incredible amount of landfill, it's an incredible amount of resource for circularity. And this research needs to understand at the consumer use phase what is going on with us that leads to clothing being kept in circulation or disposed of where we don't know what happens to it. And so, Walter, you have said in your Circular Economy User's Manual, the centre of the circular economy is you, the owner-user of objects. Whilst you're referring to industry in the manual, I believe the you is all of us as consumers of products and resources. Can you tell us more about what you mean by this in the book? Thank you, Walter.
Thank you, Lynn. Well, at the point of sale in the industrial economy, ownership and liability are passed from the manufacturer to the user, to the buyer. And that means that after the point of sale, the circular economy focused on using goods intelligently are in the hands of the owner user. For garments, this means reuse, repair, repurpose. What do we do with our garments? As individuals, my own experience is that shirts with worn-off cuffs can be turned into short-sleeve shirts. But you need a needlewoman who can do this. So you need a local skilled craftsman. But there is no publicity how to do this or why you should do this. There's no information. And you are the risk taker. So risk aversion is keeping many people from doing this. Ignorance is the main obstacle for individuals for being brave. Lack of transparency, information. But you are not alone. We are not alone. At the WEEE conference in Malta a couple of years ago, I heard the coming out of the CEO of a company who admitted to doing exactly the same thing. He never threw away a shirt. He simply had them transferred into short sleeve shirts. Now, the reuse question, there is also a proof of sterility. But again, we never look at the publicity for reuse. So, for example, many years ago, there was an OECD report on risk management that concluded that chemicals used in textile production can cause allergies in infants. In other words, only in new clothing, not in clothing that has been washed a couple of times. And so therefore the recommendation was, don't buy new clothing for infants, only buy secondhand clothing. So what we are lacking is information on the advantages of reusing and repairing textiles.
Thank you. And thanks for that response. And it's so interesting, some of the things you're saying and evidence that you have there, anecdotal evidence as well as reports, because that's what I found in my research. I did find that participants are resilient. I found, for example, instead of school shirts, there would be children's trousers, school trousers being made into shorts. Perhaps if the children had gone through the knees, and householders were deciding that no, there was still life left in those trousers. And then again, I did pick that up in the user's guide, Walter, that you said that it was it was healthier for children to be introduced to clothing that had been worn by other children. And I think that that's a really interesting and important point in our journey towards circularity, because we have to learn a lot more about consumer nuances and experiences so that we can build these confidence in these new systems, which will also require consumer behaviour to change and to learn new skills. Like you say, skills of repair, whether we want skills of repair to be small businesses in our local communities or skills of repair in the home, we really need to introduce and engage consumers in these new ways. And so, Bettina, I'd like to turn to you and to ask you, based on current and forthcoming reports that address consumers in the circular economy, particularly the Sustainability and Circularity in the Textile Value Chain Report, which is essentially a roadmap, where do you see the engagement of the consumer? Where has this been emphasised in the report? I felt, as I said at the beginning, a little challenged that the consumer, if we look at the infographic in the report, the consumer is in the top left-hand corner. And I'd really like to see, as Walter says, that it begins with you. I would like to see the consumer at the centre of that circle. And I wondered on your thoughts on that, Bettina. Thank you.
Thanks a lot, Lynn. And yeah, it's good to start from that. So definitely for us, the consumer is also central to that transition. So perhaps I can take a step back and just explain also why we refer to the value chain and not the supply chain, because the value chain is, of course, broader. So the value chain includes all of the steps from the product conception, design, through production, through the sort of purchasing decision, the use of the product, and then end of life. But the value chain goes beyond those stages, and in our definition also includes the enabling environment and what shapes that system. So for instance, in that context, that would mean what are the consumption patterns of that system, what are the business models that are actually offered to the consumer, and of course also what are the regulations and the government policies around that. So I think the graphic that you are referring to is the sort of status quo linear value chain. If you look at the one where we're trying to outline the vision, which is to close the loop and to ensure that we keep the materials at their highest possible value as long as possible, there are actually some actions that are solely at the base of the consumer. So we do have refusing as an option and reusing. And this is a decision that the consumer can actually take alone. Now, we also say in the report we have three priorities. One is around policies, one is more around financing and innovation, and the third one is around consumer consumption patterns and changing behavior. And I think we might say that this is the most difficult one to address and where maybe the least work is happening. So it's great to see your work on this. And why we are not outlining the consumer as in the middle to drive the change. The intention here is not to sideline the consumer, but to recognize that their role as citizens and as consumers is central to that transition. But we also cannot request the consumer to act alone and to be the ones to drive the change. So we recognize that we do need the industry, the businesses to change the way that products are produced, to make them, for instance, we had the example of chemicals, to make sure that certain hazardous substances are not in the product so that the consumers can safely use them longer, reuse them, repair them, and so on. But also we need the governments to take the lead and to create the enabling environment. So for us, it's all about not putting the responsibility solely on the consumer, but think about how can we make sure that we as people can take the most sustainable decisions, and that it becomes the easy option, but also the aspirational option, because at the end of the day, it is a lot about the transparency and sharing of information, but it is also about what is seen as aspiring and what is regarded as cool and so on, especially if we talk about fashion. And we do have to recognize that the fashion industry has one of the most powerful marketing engines in the world. And of course, this also influences the perception of all of us. So maybe I'll stop here.
Thank you very much. And that's a really good, you mentioned something earlier on about consumer responsibility. And I think it's really important for me to explain that by putting the consumer at the centre of the circular economy, I don't want to responsibilise the consumer as such and put all the responsibility on us, on you, but to make them the most important stakeholder in the sense of as consumers, we are the ones who end up with this resource, and we are the ones who are not the experts. We're not the resource experts. We're the user experts. And it's about how we support ourselves as consumers and citizens to really understand how we enable this circular system to work. How do we fully play our part? And I think you're absolutely right. It's always about refusing, but in the first place. But in my research, I was looking at the household, at the home, and really about what's going on a daily basis. And that's where, as Walter was saying about reuse and repair and all of the different elements of keeping a product in use for longer is so important. And Walter, if I could just come back to you there, thinking about product extension, and I'd like to talk to both of you, but start with Walter, because you do mention it in the manual about extended producer responsibility. And so, Walter, if you could just talk a little bit about that in the sense of product and the relationship between production and consumption. And then if I can come back to Bettina, if you'd like to tell us a bit more about legislation in that area and how it can help.
Well, it's very important to distinguish between producer responsibility and producer liability. I'm promoting a full producer liability, the difference between the two terms is responsibility is something that you can read in the ESG reports of a company. Liability is something that you can read in the financial reporting of a company. And investors are really looking at the financial reports. And if they see an increasing liability volume, then they shy away from investing. And then the company is forced to accept liability, reduce liability by reducing their business, the concepts, the business model, the resource consumption. But basically, why are manufacturers sticking to the produce, sell, and forget model? Is that the other model of the selling performance, of selling use? And I definitely don't talk about consumption, the consumers. That term I use for food and energy. But physical goods, we have to talk about use optimization. Forget about the consumer, because then you already imply that the consumption, that the throwaway. So if manufacturers want to change to a business model of selling the utilization, selling the use, the performance of their goods, then they have two problems. One is that they don't know these new business models in most cases, except for fleet managers. And they have the problem that many of these business models, take textile leasing, have a very limited range due to transport costs. So textile leasing has a maximum of 90 kilometers to be profitable, which means franchising systems instead of global businesses become almost a must. And as all of us, we don't really like to change if we can simply stick to the way we are doing things. Now, there is an exception. Manufacturers of long life goods, such as Patagonia, actually are using the long life as a argument in sales, but also following their talk by the walk. So in other words, Patagonia, for example, has mobile workshops that are going to all major sport events and offer free repairs for any manufacturer's sportswear. So they put their money where their mouth is, and of course it's a very successful company. Now, the other problem manufacturers have with the circular economy is that the power shifts from manufacturing to the distributors, because they are the ones that can take products back. You may have seen that the UK John Lewis has pledged to have buyback or take-back schemes operating in every product category by 2025, and to develop more rental and resale options as it steps up efforts to be a more sustainable business. Same declarations have been done by Selfridges, Bourne and Hollingsworth. And these are the big ones, but now the small and medium-sized companies are not left alone. Again, in the UK, the retail guidelines published by the British Retail Consortium to drive retailers, resale platforms, charity retailers, and other industry experts forward towards the circular economy of second-hand and pre-loved items, says it is there to help the industry on its journey to a circular economy. So we don't know who is going to win in the game, but certainly one of the key success models of the circular economy is to keep the loops very small. Don't repair something that can be reused. Don't send something abroad that can be repaired locally or reused locally. So keep things very small. And that's the best way to be successful. And I think that trend is not only the UK, more and more accepted as a guideline, as these British Retail Consortium and manufacturers that are selling goods with a lifelong guarantee.
Thank you, Walter. Yeah, you've really shared the whole spectrum of clothing reuse and longevity there. And a key interest for me and impetus for this research is in the transition to asking consumers to extend the life of clothing more and to be involved and to make it their choice model being rental or leasing. Again, it requires an understanding of where there is consumer behaviours or consumer resistance in terms of my research lens is contamination, sort of that in the literature it's referred to as hygiene, as a hygiene issue. And that goes back to your point about it being good for children to be in clothing that's worn by other children. But in terms of adults and where we're at in society, there is this challenge of acceptance of sharing models. And this is where my research aimed to tackle that and to try and shine some light on what consumers are doing. And I did find actually that in the sample, my very small qualitative sample of 30 households, consumers are really resilient and they are doing the best they can. And in that light, it's still very much the consumers doing the best they can. So, Bettina, if I can come back to you in terms of legislation and, as Walter's saying, liability as well as responsibility. Bettina, could you share with us some of the legislation and programmes that the UN and UNEP, are working towards in this area? Thank you.
Thanks, Lynn. So we do see that there is more happening on the side of legislations lately. More and more governments are starting to work also on that sector. Of course, legislation sometimes might also not be specifically for textiles. It could be something cross-cutting that's also applied. Because you mentioned extended producer responsibility. Here we, of course, have the new EU textile strategy that is also planning to develop more in that space. And the plan as of now, as far as I know, is to propose harmonized EU EPR rules for textiles by next year. What's always interesting for us is, of course, to look at the global picture because it is such a global sector, such a global value chain. So we also, when implementing these kind of rules and regulations, we also have to think about who else is part of that value chain. So, of course, the consumers, but also the producers, whom is that providing jobs to in other countries, and how can we include all of those players so that it's also a just transition and that everybody is part and every voice is heard. In general, we do feel that there is still a lack of policies and regulations, or perhaps it's not so much a lack of policies and regulations, but there is a need to coordinate that more at global level, so that it's not one country going ahead with one regulation, but maybe not taking into account how that will then impact other countries, because for textiles it always will, because it is, as I said, such a global value chain. So we do see space for more coordination around that. And especially if we speak about circularity. This is, I don't know, Walter, you might disagree because it's been a concept that's been around for so long, but it still feels like a new field to many players. Also, for instance, if we look at metrics of how to measure success, we do feel that there are good measurements in other spaces. But when it comes to circular economy and how do we then actually measure those benefits, there is still really scope. And in terms of policies, I think one of the key challenges with textiles, and then also to enable the consumers to take more informed decisions, is also the transparency and traceability of the products along the value chain. And this is also something where policies could support more. I wanted to add, because EPR is one instrument, but what we have identified as a key priority for brands, at least to take forward, would be to really look at the business model and to dematerialize the business value. And here it's also important to see about different options. So I think we can agree that at the stage of the consumer, the reuse and repair of the product is probably always the best option. But then when it comes to other business models, such as rental of, let's say, for instance, children clothing, I think that is one where rental is actually quite a popular approach. But then we have to see about how is that also used. If it is a rental where you replace items on a weekly basis and then they have to be washed and disinfected and sent back and forth, then that might actually come with a higher footprint than to buy. So we do have to see also how these different business models and the use at the stage of the consumer compare. And I also wanted to mention, because we talk about policies, that the policies shouldn't only be about talking to the brands and the producers and putting in place the incentives and disincentives for them to provide more circular business models. But it can also really be about helping the consumer to take better decision. So we do have a report that's called Enabling Sustainable Lifestyles in the Climate Emergency. So that looks at different sectors, but we do have a few recommendations for fashion, and this is really about choice editing. So to edit in sustainable options and make them the obvious and easy choice, and also editing out the more harmful options, so that they don't even enter the market, and then also creating equitable access to ensure well-being. And this is also very important because often sustainability and circularity is perceived as something that is a bit for the elite and is more expensive. And so it's also the work to make sure that this is a fair and equitable access that each consumer can benefit from.
Thank you, Bettina, and thanks for that last point. That does speak to my research. As we know from previous research, it is consumers who are more who are potentially higher educated, who are the ones who are evidenced as engaging in sustainability across product ranges. And that is a key challenge for me going forward, is how I acquire new data from a wider socioeconomic demographic to look at that just transition. But what I did find in relation to just going back in terms of, we do want transparency and traceability from brands at the production stage. But what I found at the disposal stage was really lack of transparency and traceability. And that was really interesting, looking at all the models of circulation, thinking about the smaller loops that we want, where, for example, if a consumer is selling a garment on a digital platform, then they have to, if they're selling it on a digital platform, they have the address of the next receiver. And so they have that traceability of where that garment is going. But when it goes into, say, the textile recycling system, it's a gamble, really. They have no idea whether that garment is going to be reused or not. So the consumer is disposing optimistically or for convenience. And so that idea of transparency and traceability, looking at that whole cycle at the post-consumer stage is really important and interesting for me, and comes back to that 92 million tonnes disposed of in landfill globally, how we understand how that's occurring. But thank you both for your responses. If I could just talk about where the circular economy is in terms of progress being made. So we've talked about some of the challenges and some of the policy and legislation. But Walter, can I ask you, where do you see the most progress being made in the transition to a circular economy?
Well, actually, the progress is everywhere, but it is not necessarily visible because the manufacturing economy is dominating the news. So, for example, we are all buying and selling secondhand goods almost daily, but we are not aware of it. The example is banknotes. You have never had a new banknote. It's always a secondhand, used, it's dirty, with all kind of pollution on it. The reason why you accept it at face value is that it is guaranteed by the Bank of England or the European Central Bank. So it's that the value is not the product itself, which has absolutely zero value. It's the guaranteed by somebody. And I think that is the very important thing if we talk about second-hand or pre-owned goods. Now, where is the progress? The progress is, for example, in education. There is one of the major German private universities has now started the textile department has now started a Repair Rebels initiative to educate students to stand up for repairs and for reuse. And of course, if you don't learn it as a child or as a student, then it's very difficult to learn it later on. But there is also new professions. For example, in Switzerland, we now have a new profession accepted federally of vehicle restorers. In other words, you can, in a 3-year course, learn how to restore vehicles, vintage cars, for example. We have always had this for clocks. And there is everywhere new local SMEs are springing up. For example, the emergence of what I mentioned, the needle women workshops that used to be limited basically to old people to alterations of their clothing. And now in place like Geneva, you have every quarter, every district has 1 or 2 of these workshops simply doing alterations and preparing garments for reuse, repurpose. Then that this is the economy, but we also have innovations in the circular society. Think of repair cafes, which are a very European success, or the reuse of food waste, which was initiated in France by legislation, but has now spread, I think, to almost all European countries, driven also by poverty, but also by surplus food production. Then the platform economy, we have to be careful because there is a platform economy for rental, shared tools, vehicles, rooms, Airbnb, for example. But many of these are anonymous and therefore victims of abuse and vandalism. B2C e-scooters, for example, have a technical life of several years, a real life of less than 6 months because of abuse and vandalism. Same with Airbnb. A lot of people are withdrawing from it because they had their apartment was vandalized in their absence. So this is the platform economy. If it's personal, like car rental, then it works. If it's anonymous, then unfortunately we are faced with abuse. The B2B performance economy is probably the biggest success story, but again, you don't see it. So, for example, manufacturers offering business models of rental, leasing, pay-per-use is very common now for production equipment, vehicles, cranes, even textiles, or take the high-tech, the reusable Falcon rockets by SpaceX. All these are companies selling the use of objects, not the objects themselves. And then we have fleet managers that in the textile business, the Dutch armed forces are probably the most advanced manager of textile stocks, because they really take it, they buy the textiles, the garments, they don't produce the uniforms and all this, but then they follow it through with repair, reuse, repurpose, and in the end, reclaiming the fibers by from uniforms that cannot not be reused. So the most of the examples I've just listed, I've just told you, we have probably never heard of. So again, the problem with the circular economy is that it lacks the sex appeal of manufacturing. If you go to a car show, you see all these great, bigger, better, faster, safer vehicles. If you go to a second-hand car dealer, you don't really get this sex appeal. You simply buy function. And basically, the performance economy is selling function, not sex appeal. And so therefore, even for journalists, it lacks really interest.
Thank you. I think that's really interesting in terms of what's happening in society. And what I think we see, or what I saw in my research, is that younger generations are much more excited about those sharing economies and performance economies. And I call them, when I was looking at households and say the informant from a household was sharing stories, and some of those stories were about, say, the daughter who'd become a bedroom entrepreneur, upcycling garments and then reselling them on a digital platform. So that idea of or renting, they were more likely. I had a young participant who had been involved in the sharing of ball gowns in her halls of residence in the university. They decided that it was better to have a closet of ball gowns that they could all just dip in and out of, because it was such a high output. And that was a couple of years ago, at least 3 or 4 years ago now. And since then, rental of formal attire has evolved, but there was still that idea of sharing in a closed space, in an intimate space, was really exciting. And again, a lot of my research was done during the pandemic. And what I saw from that was, in the absence of industrial services being available to dispose or to circulate product, communities were then setting up their own digital platforms, their own Facebook groups, WhatsApp groups. And for example, one household, they had a bag of children's clothing, and they put it in the bag and they put it on the front door handle, and they put it on the WhatsApp Facebook group, and they said, children's clothing, size age 5 to 7, it will be on the door 7 o'clock tonight, first come, first serve. And that idea of that sort of disruption to things by creating, when we have to stand still, when the system stands still, consumers intervene and find their own path. And I thought that was, these models are these disruptions are really exciting. And also, yeah, and it's that idea of keeping things very small, keeping things local, as well as where we want those global manufacturers to provide different services and access to products. And I think this comes back to, perhaps it's the younger generations that are going to make these models more attractive. Bettina, can I refer to you in terms of, where is circular economy progress being made in terms of advancing consumer engagement or consumer awareness of the circular economy and clothing?
Thanks, Lynn. And I just want to add actually to what Walter and you have been saying, because it's great to listen to you. And I fully agree. I also think there is a lot that is actually out there, but maybe is just not communicated or picked up that much. We can also think about, traditional solutions, indigenous knowledge, and in many cultures, the sort of circular economy and sharing has been a very common theme. So to learn there and to also revive those habits. I think the point you just touched upon is also interesting in terms of emotional durability, right? Because it is, on the one side, it is also about the function, and this is where we need the production with good materials, etc., things that can actually last. But what's much more important when we talk about textiles, especially clothing, is the emotional connection. And I think all of us could relate if we had, our favorite sweater passed on from our grandparents to us. Of course, you take better care of it because there's a story around it. And I did like that example that you just brought with the sharing during the pandemic. And I guess also because it was local and maybe the people knew each other, or there was this sort of coming together element that also reinforced then the value in the product because there's a story around it. So it is also very much about this. And so we also do see progress there. But I think there is scope for more, and there's scope to report more on this and to hear more those stories that really center around the consumer, because this is something also attending conferences, meetings. It is usually something that is considered last. And we would also like to see that more central.
And that's really great to hear, because I think as qualitative researchers here at the university, we do understand, we do hear those stories. We are gathering that data all the time and really learning those consumer stories of experience. It's really interesting about emotional durability and the difference between, because the other challenge with trying to circulate resources is hoarding, is the keeping of resources. And we know that 40% of the average wardrobe, for example, is never worn. And we have to understand the difference between emotional durability and keeping something because it's going to be kept in use and it's going to be handed down, and what consumers are actually storing or keeping from use. And so that's another area that is really important in terms of looking at what consumers are actually doing that's obstructing this circulation. And so for me, that's sort of areas of future research to understand further what consumers are doing. But if I can ask first Walter, I'll go back to Walter and then come back to yourself, Bettina. But what action and research is now needed to continue to advance consumer behaviour and the circularity and circularity? And we've started to touch on communication and lack of awareness. Walter, could you perhaps share with us some of the ideas or solutions you have for how we can centralise the citizen, the consumer, you, us, in this circular economy? How can we advance action and research? Thank you.
Well, one on the behavioral sciences, one trick is certainly what I call the teddy bear effect. Because why do we not throw away a teddy bear? Because it knows all our secrets. And I have the same relationship with many goods, including cars. I have 2 cars that are more than 50 years old, but they know basically all my life. And so therefore, I have them repaired and whatever. I don't even look at the cost because they are part of my life, and vice versa. But so the research is, I think, how to promote local reuse and repair infrastructures and guarantees in the area of R. In the research in the area of the de-linking materials, in the textile business, develop technology to recover fibers for reuse, either as fibers or molecules, if it's plastic, nylon, for example, depolymerization, but not all polymers can be reused today because we don't have technologies. Then developing clean tech. If we look at the environment, the release of plastic nanoparticles in garments, in washing, is the second source of nanoplastics in the environment after car tire wear and tear. And so how can they produce textiles that don't give off these nanoparticles in washing? Because this is a major pollution. We always talk about the plastics in the oceans, but there's more plastic nanoparticles in land and lakes and the oceans than the big ones which are visible. Then adapt policy frameworks. The circular economy is very labor intensive. So if you want to promote it, do not tax labor. Tax things you don't want. And no value-added tax on circular economy services, because the circular economy is value-maintaining activities, not value-added. How to spread knowledge and information. One thing I'm telling all students and school goers that are wearing jeans, that to produce a pair of jeans, you need 11 tons of water, 11,000 liters of water. By doubling the life of a pair of jeans, you actually save 11,000 liters of water. And if people don't know it, they cannot act. If they know it, then they start to think. And of course, same thing with CO2 emissions. So how to educate users to overcome ignorance in the advantages of the circular economy, such as the infant health issue. How to promote resource savings technologies. Cold wash detergents, for example, can wash textiles without heating the water, but they are not really promoted by the detergent industry, and especially the washing machine industry, and promote resource-saving business models. The leasing of uniforms, that's very common with airlines and in factories, has a break-even point of 3 years, which means leased uniforms are only profitable if they use the highest quality garments. So in other words, you have the same effect that it's only long life textiles that are less profitable in the uniform, in the textile leasing business. But over to Bettina.
Thank you, Walter. That was, I'm really glad that you brought up the teddy bear effect. I always think of that in terms of that teddy bear embodying so much about consumer emotion, going back to Bettina's point about emotional durability and how do we use that as an education tool, I think is always a fantastic metaphor. And then, polymers, 60% of clothing in our wardrobes is polymer based, and we really need to, I believe, engage consumers in understanding, like you say, understanding what's actually going on with clothing, what's going on when they wash it. Because what I find is that consumers are not as aware as we would like them to be about what's in their clothing and what they're actually wearing. And so I think these are really important areas to take forward. Bettina, but I know that you have some new products that UNEP are launching. Are you able to share or explain how you're taking this work forward and what action and research you'd also like to do or to see being done in the future?
So we are about in the next few months to publish 2 reports. So one of them will be out this year, and that would be the follow-on to the report we mentioned in the beginning, that will outline a roadmap of how to move towards more circularity and sustainability in that value chain, and that will outline sort of the actions that different stakeholders groups can take. In that report, again, we do not put specific actions for the consumer to take, but we put a lot of actions to create the enabling environment and to help the consumers to take those decisions. Because it is such an important topic, we are publishing sort of a follow-on to that will focus around communicating sustainable fashion. That should be out next year. And this is actually something that is a follow-on work for those of you who are following that, the United Nations Framework Convention on Climate Change has the Fashion Industry Charter for Climate Action. And at the last climate conference, at the last COP last year, there was a new dedicated commitment added to that charter that is around communication efforts. And so we are producing a playbook that is helping everybody who is communicating with consumers to do so in a way that enables more sustainable behaviors. So this obviously includes the brands, the companies that communicate about their products, but also the media, influencers, governments, basically anybody who is speaking to citizens, to consumers also around sustainable fashion. And goes, of course, also beyond product level communication. And the reason why we're doing this is that, I mean, we often talk about the challenges and all of the impacts that sector is causing, but at the same time, it is also a sector that is full of creativity. There are so many creative people engaged. So if we can take that creativity and turn it towards informing and changing behaviors around sustainability, we even think that that can then be applied to other lifestyle domains, because most of us, we do not think in sectors. So we think about how can I be more sustainable? And then it's about how do we get to work or to the school? What do we eat? How do we dress ourselves, right? And so that playbook will outline certain principles that anybody communicating around sustainable fashion should follow. And I'll just give you a high-level view, and this is all still work in progress. But we have a sort of hierarchy to be followed. So at the most basic level, we call it the information layer. And the principle here is to lead with science. So this is clearly to not do any greenwashing, to make sure that any information that is passed on is grounded on science, and that we also communicate about things that matter, right? So we do communicate about the biggest impact of the product or how to decrease that impact, and not something that actually doesn't really have an effect. Then the next layer is touching more upon the culture, because we have to recognize that all of this is very much part of also culture. And here we have 2 principles. So one is changing behaviors and practices, and the other one is reimagining values. So we do feel that this is what can have the biggest impact, and where most of the communication stakeholders should be focusing on, so that we can create a new vision, new aspirations for people to embrace. But it's also where most of the work will have to be done, because it is still the most challenging field. And then at the peak of the pyramid, we have an advocacy layer around driving advocacy. So that is also going beyond the own organization and practice, and to support broader sustainability change within the sector. And we do know there's a lot of collaboration needed, so that there is also the joint work and the joint vision to move towards that. So that's just a teaser. But yeah, the important thing is that there is a lot of work to be done in this. You did ask about other research that's needed. There is a lot, but if we think about what we're discussing today, we do feel there is a serious lack of data. And if we want to have transparency and traceability and clear information for the consumers, we do need that data sharing. And you also touched upon it, the part of maybe we might have that transparency and traceability at one point up to point of sale, but we also have to go further and continue engaging throughout the use phase and then also at end of life if it can't be avoided. And the other, what we would like to see more is more research around how can we really change consumer behavior, more good practices. Also something that is more global or examples from different regions, because we do see that there is a lot of the work happening more in the sort of European, North American sphere at the moment, and most of the examples also come from there. And we do feel there are a lot of good examples from all regions, but they are just not documented well enough. So this is also something we would like to see more going forward.
Thank you so much. Thank you for sharing all of that. I think in terms of a lot of collaboration needed, certainly my colleagues and I at the University of Glasgow, we are here to help in terms of working on these solutions and gathering data, and we certainly have a lot of data, but we also acknowledge that there is so much more research needs to be done. But I'm so looking forward to seeing the consumer playbook and really excited that this project is going ahead. Walter and Bettina, you have been incredibly generous in sharing your expertise and your experience, and I'm very grateful for you joining me today. And I really look forward to further conversations. But in the meantime, thank you very much, and very best of luck with all of your own work. Thank you.
It's been a pleasure.
Likewise. Thank you, Lynn. Thank you, Walter.
Bye-bye.
Thank you for an interesting conversation. Bye.
Thank you for listening and watching Cleaning the Loop, Driving Consumer Clothing Circularity, a podcast series produced by the Adam Smith Business School, University of Glasgow. If you would like to know more about my research or that of the scholars participating in the podcast series, please email me at lynn.wilson@glasgow.ac.uk. Thank you for listening and watching.